Pact has a brand new pack of cards. Let's see what's inside.
Welcome back, everybody, and it's about time I stopped just talking about it and running on this joke for too long. So today, I'm going to be reviewing, finally, the long-awaited Indaznak's Pit. And look, you can see that this is not fake. I will get my scissors, and I will cut this open right now, right in front of you. This is not a whole boy who cried wolf situation. This is Indaznak's Pit. Fooled ya! That was just a little sleight of hand I just cut at the gates. I've been working on my sleight of hand. Let me know what you guys think. It definitely helps with card games. Starting off, as always, with the Starks, we have Alassane Mormont. She is another card with the House Mormont trait, which we saw in a recent pack opening was supported by, I think, Mage Mormont. And like I said, I know very little about the Starks, so I'm learning a lot more about the in-faction sub-archetypes as we go. And House Mormont is perhaps the one that I have become the most affiliated with since doing these pack openings. Most of the House Mormont cards I've noticed are loyal. This one is not, but it doesn't really help her because it seems to me like from at least Mage Mormont's ability that the support for Mormonts comes a lot from running a dedicated Stark deck, so she might as well be loyal. She's not exactly splashable, or at least this archetype isn't. Yeah, and look at her own ability. While each character you control has a Stark affiliation, she might as well be loyal. You're not going to splash her into a half Stark, half Dorn deck or whatever you're building. Of course, she is a low-cost lady, which is awesome. You can sack her for Heir to the Iron Throne and then bring out Ned Stark or something and go like +4 on gold. I normally say that this is a huge boon having this trait, but other than Seal of the Hand and Bodyguard, I don't really think this faction needs that many more low-cost targets for Heir. Let's assume you're running a dedicated Stark build, so her effect is always active. That means she will always have stealth during military challenges and will not kneel. This is pretty good, especially for a 3 cost if we consider that it's always active, which if you build your deck, it will be. That being said, the Starks have a lot of military power already. Not kneeling is good, but there are plenty of other cards that can restand themselves, like Great John Umber. So this card is solid for a 3 cost, 2 icons, good stats, pretty easy to guarantee ability that provides you combat advantage, but it doesn't do much more than that. I can't see it comboing with anything else except for the fact that it's just a House Mormont card and a Lady card. And next to location, Old Gate. So once again, this is a card that relies on you having only Stark cards in your deck, or mostly Stark cards, because you can only trigger it when you only have Stark cards out. It's one of those locations that every single faction has, where it's limited, it costs 1, it gives you +1 gold, and then when certain conditions are met, you can sacrifice this card to draw 2 cards. These cards are not as versatile as Rose Road because A, they're in faction, and B, they have the same gold modifier, except they cost 1 instead of being free, so you don't actually start gaining an income advantage for a second, but they offer you the ability to sacrifice it. This one is by far the easiest one to build your deck around to trigger. There is nothing your opponent can do to stop you, except if they're playing a Night's Watch deck and they use Broken Vows to give you one of their cards. If you've built your deck correctly, you're going to have only Starks. This will trigger whenever you want it to. Also, as I've said, I love in-faction cards that sacrifice themselves because King's Landing can bring them back. And since this is such an easy trigger condition, you could sack it every turn to draw 2 cards. That is huge. I don't have anything else to say about it. I think it's really good. Next, we have like the 3rd or 4th version of the Knight of Flowers. I've lost count. He's still a Kingsguard, and he's non-loyal, so he fits into the White Books deck. His faction might as well be White Book. Even if you're running a Tyrell Shadow deck that can trigger this guy's ability a lot, Tyrells don't have any other Kingsguard. It would just be pointless. I really don't like how all the recently released Kingsguard that you have to run if you're running a White Book deck, which seems like a really fun deck, they all have this weird Shadow mechanic, so you sort of also have to build your deck around Shadow, and at that point, if you're trying to build a deck that runs out of faction, non-loyal cards, you might as well just use Kingdom of Shadow to do that, since most of these Kingsguard have Shadow, and this guy is no exception. That being said, this is one of the better ones, at least in terms of supporting the other Kingsguard you'll have in the deck, because a lot of them have Shadow. The only competition for Kingsguard support is Jaime. This guy is good, because his Shadow isn't pointless. He actually supports other Shadow cards, so he gives them some small bit of synergy in between all these random cards that just happen to have the same trait that they shoved into this one deck with an agenda. He is the only one who actually supports the weird shadowness that came with it. So when you bring out Sir Robert Strong or Sir Mandon Moore or whatever, because you don't have that many Kingsguard you can run, you're going to be running a bunch of his shadow, you can use Knight of Flowers to support that. He also has Renown, and having Renown is always best on a character that has the ability to stand itself again. Even without his ability, the agenda, the White Books itself can stand him, so Renown is good. He's quite costly, but all the Kingsguard are, and he's definitely worth having out in that deck. In Tyrell's, I think he's trash, especially considering that they have so many other better versions of the Knight of Flowers that directly synergize with their strategy. Ah, yes, the next card should bring some deja vu. It's Gate of the Gods. It's a limited in-faction location, which costs 1, gives you a +1 gold modifier, and then has a trigger condition to draw 2 cards. It's the exact same as the Stark one. Every faction has this. This one's trigger condition is if you control the character with the highest strength in play, you can sack it. This is pretty cool because your opponent might not see it coming, because this is a challenges action. You can use events to buff your characters in the middle of the challenges phase. They don't know that you're about to draw 2 cards, and then if you're already using events to do that, and your deck might have a lot of events, you might actually draw randomly into 2 more events that can buff your characters even more. Again, it goes without saying that King's Landing can bring this back. This is a pretty solid card. It's not the hardest trigger condition to meet, but unlike the Stark one, it is at least somewhat dependent on your opponent's board state, although because of that, and because you can manipulate your characters to get more strength at the last second, it has an element of surprise that's kind of cool. However, it's just not as easy to guarantee. Moving on to the Night's Watch, we have Aged Craftsman, a great character. He's a non-loyal builder. His stats are trash. Like all builders, he only has 1 icon, like most Night's Watch characters. Having 1 strength for a 3 cost is really bad. However, when he enters play, you search the top 10 cards of your deck for a Night's Watch location with printing cost 2 or lower, and you put it right into play. That is a very good ability. There are a lot of Night's Watch locations that are printed cost 2 or lower. You can give this guy a lot of targets. They have 2 in-faction limited cards. Since this guy puts them directly into play, it doesn't matter if you've already played a limited card that round. He can just splash them in. This is a bit of a double-edged sword, though, because when a card is put into play, it's not counted as being marshaled. It's very frustrating, the card Northern Rookery, which essentially does nothing except give you a reserve modifier and +1 card that you get to draw when you marshal it. You won't actually even get that card. You would just be putting in something that was 2 cost just for a little bit of extra reserve. That is frustrating. However, that's based on how you build your deck, and that would go more along with Stewards anyway. You might not be running too many locations except for the reserve ones, so you might not need this guy. So this kind of searchability in a Night's Watch deck that has so many great locations is great. It's unfortunate that both versions of the Wall and White Tree, which are probably their best 3 locations, are not capable of being put into play by this guy. However, he can search so many other things. The Haunted Forest, for instance, combined with At the Palace of Shadows is great. Just getting locations on the board for them is great if you're using something like Eastwatch Carpenter to get more gold, which would be another builder. Othel Yarwick can use those locations, even if they do nothing, to give people challenges icons. Halder can do something similar where he can kneel them to give people strength. If you ran a lot of builders like this guy, having locations is great, and this search ability, he's basically just a building orders as soon as you play him. What's unfortunate is that he's one of those cards that then does nothing. I mean, his stats are trash. He has 1 icon, no attachments. Once he enters play, you do that, and it's great, but then you can't use him again. Or can you? That's right. The seemingly useless card, Journey to Old Town, which is a Night's Watch 0-cost event, can remove this guy from the game at the beginning of the plot phase until the next plot phase starts. And I'm fairly certain that that would count as him re-entering play and you could trigger his ability again. So I've recently actually been trying to make some Night's Watch decks that make Journey to Old Town, which seems pretty bad, work by re-triggering these cards who have really good effects when they're played, but then just cease to function on the board. Cold Hands and the 6-cost version of Yorin and probably some other cards. This guy just synergizes so well with it. I mean, he's non-unique, so you don't have to worry about having 3 copies of him out. Using Journey to Old Town on him to just every turn search the top 10 cards of your deck for Night's Watch location to put directly into play. So you're basically only going down 1 gold because you pay 3 for him, and then you can put 1 that costs 2 directly into play, but you also get the surprise factor, and then you also get the admittedly negligible factor of having 1 strength and 1 icon on the board. You also get an extra builder. He's just a great searcher. The fact that you can use shenanigans to reuse him doesn't make him that much better because those shenanigans are so niche, but using them on him is so good. There is a whole plot card dedicated to essentially this effect, and this is a somewhat more restricted version of it, but being able to run 3 copies, being able to play 3 copies, and then being able to reuse them, you could have like 20 Night's Watch locations and your deck would function perfectly. You could have so many valid targets for him, it's crazy. The likelihood of you not finding one is so low if you build your deck correctly. This guy is just a great card. Even if you're not running a builder deck, there's a good chance you're running like 10 Night's Watch locations that would work. That why not just have out? Fill your board with stuff. Search your deck a little bit. This guy is great, and he's non-loyal. Now we have one of the cards I actually just mentioned, Flea Bottom Alley. So it's a limited Night's Watch location, and its effect is you kneel and sacrifice it, toss in a Night's Watchman from your hand, and then draw a card. This is what I mean. This guy would be able to search that out and put it directly into play, even if you had already played a Rose Road or any other limited card that round, because you're allowed to marshal 1 limited card per turn, but putting it into play doesn't count. But it is great for deck cycling. It does provide you gold advantage. It's good that it is a card like King's Road or Rose Road, but it's in a faction that likes their locations to be in faction. So having options like Flea Bottom Alley and options like Underground Vault as ways of getting gold without having to play neutral locations so you can stay true to all the Night's Watch builder support is awesome. And of course, this sacrifices itself, so if you are running King's Landing, which unfortunately is a neutral card and is unfortunately rather costly, you could be able to fetch this back. King's Landing works pretty well in a Night's Watch deck because there are so many locations. However, they also like to stay in faction with their locations, and as you can see with each Craftsman, they have enough searchability that you don't necessarily need to run as many copies of each location that might make King's Landing worth it. It might not be as good on this card as it is in similar cards in other factions, but it is still worth noting. Flea Bottom Alley I don't usually use, but if Underground Vault isn't triggering reliably enough for you, this one gives you a little more agency in how you use it, but you still have to build your deck around it, and it's still only going to give you 2 gold advantage, but the cycling is still nice. Now we have a card that I've never really understood. So Roller Infiltrator, you can give Roller Infiltrator to your opponent and then get a power. This is a very weird and enigmatic card to me. I've been trying to figure out the purpose of this card for a while. We talked earlier about a couple of star cards that rely on all their cards being in faction, so this would be a counter pick to that. I guess the idea is that you're exchanging a card you have on the field for a power. That doesn't really synergize with either the Baratheons or the Rollers. Giving this up, I would say actually goes against a lot of the core Baratheon strategy of winning dominance, because at the end of dominance, you give it to them to have 1 fewer standing thing, and so you gain a power, sure, but now you lost a card and your opponent gained a card. I cannot stress this enough. The reason why Seductive Promise and any card that can take control of an opponent's card directly from their field is so good is because if I take a card from an opponent's discard pile, I get 1 more guy, right? If I get rid of a card on their field, they lose 1 guy. The gap increases by 1 either way. But if you take 1 from their field and you put it on yours, you have just increased the gap between your characters and theirs by 2. That is massive. And to give that power to your opponent, to give up 1 of your cards and to give them an extra card with 2 icons, mind you, although not power, which is good because Baratheons don't want any competition with power, it's just not worth it at all to me unless you can think of some kind of strategy that would involve that. It's kind of cool that your opponent can do this to you as well. So I don't know what they were trying to go for with that. Like they trade it back and forth for power like Braun. But it's very weird. It's one of those cards that has the spy keyword also, which a lot of Dornish cards do. I haven't seen any support for it, but this card being a roller doesn't make any sense. This card existing doesn't really make any sense. I would understand if they had a card that was like Smuggling Infiltrator, right? That was just a Baratheon card that did this. I would still say, what is the point of this? This doesn't synergize with the rest of the faction. But this one is particularly weird in that it's roller. A lot of their synergy has to do with having rollers on the field and things, and you're giving up your rollers. There's no roller synergy that I've seen that has to do with the amount of rollers total on the field, or like sacrifice a roller from anywhere on the field to do this. If that were the case, that would be cool, because you could give this up to them to get the power and then sack it from their side of the field for whatever cost. However, that is not the case, and 1 power is not worth 2 gold and giving your opponent a card. It's not worth it at all. I don't think this card is good, but I know that there is a reason it was printed, so please tell me what combo I am missing. Another stupid Shadow Kingsguard. So Sir Mandon Moore has an effect that only activates when he comes out of Shadows. So if we'll remember, the version of the Knight of Flowers that was a Kingsguard with Shadows had an effect that buffed other things coming out of Shadows, so he supported the idea that you would build your deck around having cards with Shadow. Sir Mandon just has an effect when he comes out of Shadows. And it's one of my least favorite kinds of effects, which is an effect that gives your opponent a choice. They either kill a character or they toss 2 cards from their hand. They are going to pick the one that is less detrimental to them. There's no uncertainty. They can say, these are the 2 cards I get rid of. Is that better than killing this guy? They get to choose in both cases, and they get to choose which case they pick. I think that's pretty bad. Now, neither of their options are great. They're either going down 2 on hand, even though they get to pick, or basically you're resolving military claim. Is that worth the cost of this? It costs him 2 to marshal into Shadow, and then 3 to marshal out of Shadow. That's 5, and since marshaling him out of Shadow can't be reduced with King's Road or Great Hall or anything, that's a solid 3 that you have to have during the middle of the challenges phase. And for what? For them to choose the lesser of 2 evils, and then from that lesser of 2 evils choose what they're giving up? That's not worth it. These shadow cards are too expensive. If you just marshal him, he does nothing except sit there and be a Kingsguard. He does have an intrigue icon, which is nice because not a lot of them do, but it's also annoying because there's a support card that gives every Kingsguard an intrigue icon. So in fact, he is even less supported by Kingsguard stuff than everything else. But the Knight of Flowers can save him because it can stand Kingsguard when he comes out of Shadows. He also is a Lannister. Most Kingsguard are. It is unfortunate that they aren't spread out more, but it does make sense because the Lannisters seem to control the crown. Yeah, there's a lot of Lannister Kingsguard. You don't even need to run the white books to have a little bit of in-faction Kingsguard support if you're running Lannisters. You do need to run the white books if you're using literally any other faction. Overall, I would say this is one of the weaker ones. He's also one of the more frustrating ones in that his ability involves Shadow, and then after he's in play, unless you can put him back in Shadow, he does nothing. And he's just one of the more frustrating Shadow cards in general, in that he technically has a marshalling cost, but you wouldn't actually marshal him because having stats and no effect is not worth 4 gold. I don't love this card, but he must exist to promote the only type of synergy that the Kingsguard deck has, which is Shadow, and they do need a type of synergy despite being from different factions because of their agenda. So this card has to exist, but I don't think he's particularly good. He kind of annoys me and reminds me how they've misused the Shadow trait on a lot of characters, in my opinion. Jesus, is this the pack where they introduced all this? Okay, well, I'm going to speed through this one. Lionsgate. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same fucking shit that we've seen on all of them. And this one supports cards in Shadows. If you control 2 or more cards in Shadows, you sack it to draw 2 cards. So if you're making a Lannister Shadow deck, which I have, it's very good. And as we just saw, a lot of the Kingsguard, most of which are Lannister, are Shadows. They have good Shadow cards. They have Cersei, which really supports Shadows. They have a couple of good locations that really support things coming out of Shadows. You can do either Shadow Agenda. You can do Assault from Shadows or Kingdom of Shadows, as long as you just have things in Shadows. This is also good because I've seen a lot of cards that are, if you control more cards in Shadows than your opponent, do this. But this one just requires you to have 2. So it doesn't depend on your opponent at all. And you can draw 2 cards. It's similar to the rest of them except the Stark one. The Stark one is the best one. This one only works in a specific deck. In that deck, you'll almost always trigger it, but it does require you to spend a little bit of gold to do it. It's a good card. They're all good cards. They're all good fucking cards, and King's Landing can bring them back. Baelor Blacktide. This card's interesting. I keep trying to run him, and I occasionally see success. He is meant for a pillage deck, but he doesn't have the pillage keyword, the Ironborn trait, nor any trait, really, that will help him except for maybe Captain. Basically, even though he doesn't have pillage, even though he has absolutely no ability to mill your opponent's deck or even discard things from their hand or field, he has a pillage supporting passive lingering effect while he's on the field, where as long as he's there, your opponent can't play any extra copies of events that are in their discard pile. Since people probably run multiple copies of events because they are by their very nature not possibly unique, he can be pretty good. And if you're pillaging up their deck, it's just a nice little fail-safe to have. If you pillage one copy of their event, it's not just, oh, now they can't use that. Even if they have extra copies, now they really cannot use that against me. That event is gone as long as I have Baylor in play. It's just unfortunate that, at least in the non-loyal pool, there aren't enough cards with pillage that you can afford to splash in a 4 cost that doesn't have pillage that has this support, especially when this support, while not bad, while having its placed, if this were like a 2 or 3 cost location, that'd be great. It's not worth 4. It's pretty situational, and he doesn't have pillage himself. In a dedicated pillage deck, or in a different kind of out-of-faction deck, maybe where you're focusing more on intrigue or things like that, a Night's Watch deck perhaps, he can work a little bit better. However, his effect requires them to have a big discard pile and is definitely meant to synergize with pillage, but he doesn't have the Ironborn trait, which is annoying because he doesn't get buffed by Asha. He doesn't have the Lord trait, so you can't search him out. He doesn't have the pillage keyword, which is really frustrating. The only thing he has going for him is that he's a captain. I found that the support for them isn't that great. And why the hell does he have the 7 trait? I'm genuinely, like, I get it lore-wise, but I would love to hear anyone's comments on how that could be exploited in another deck, possibly using the Faith Militant agenda or possibly just not. How that would benefit him in any way, because I've tried to think of some combos. I'm not too familiar with the 7 card, so I haven't, but I would be very curious if you could, because I have the same thoughts about Davos Seaworth, and it's like the 7 trait just sort of shows up on random characters who lore-wise do worship the 7. I kind of can't help but think about how you would put that to use, so let me know. Wow, fucking Irongate. If you are the first player, sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. What do I have to say about this? The Greyjoys like to be the first player. They have a ton of support for it. They have ways that help them become the first player, and they have cards that get buffed when you are the first player. They love to do that. This supports that. It's the same as everything else. Let's move on. New version of Viserion, that's weird. So yeah, you can ambush this one, and since he's a fucking dragon, he can't have any attachments. He has that classic Targaryen support where you can discard cards from your hand to pay for his effect, but maybe it's not actually a cost. Maybe you discarded Missandei or Friedman or Jorah and they want to be discarded, or maybe you have Barristan out and you get buffs if your opponent has more cards in their hand. So a lot of newer Targaryen cards like to discard stuff, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. And he gains Intimidate. Intimidate is awesome. Intimidate is probably the best keyword. There are other versions of Viserion, obviously. There's the baby one, and there's the other full-grown one. I wonder if this is like a medium one, because he's medium cost. But either way, they're really easy to search out. They buff Daenerys simply by existing. Ambush, Intimidate is really good. All the dragons are good, and this one has 2 icons, unlike big fat old Drogon over there. Yeah, really good card. Too bad your opponent's going to take control of it with Dragonbinder. If you control 2 or more attachments, sacrifice Dragon's Gate to draw 2 cards. So we all know what this card does. I guess it's worth mentioning that a lot of the Targaryen support I've seen that came out after the whole initial strategy of reducing their strength to 0 and killing them with dragons and Daenerys does revolve around attachments, and they have a lot of ways to search them. They have even a in-faction event, which is just cost X. Get any attachment you want and put it into play on a character you control of that same cost. Considering attachments are cheap, that's crazy. Run 3 of those and you can equip whatever you want as long as it's not like Milk of the Poppy to your opponent. So that's what they're going for here. But I am done talking about these stupid cards. I guess this is the pack where they invented these locations. Good. I'm glad there's some diversity in the limited cards in this game. I'm glad there are in-faction limited cards, but if you have lost 2 or more challenges faced, sacrifice Rivergate to draw 2 cards. Let me let you in on a little secret that you probably could have figured out by reading that. Dornish people like to lose challenges. Maybe that's not the part of the strategy you picked to build your deck around. If you did, you can have that 1 gold out, and then when you need the 2 cards, you can probably make that happen. It's very likely, and it's a very high trigger condition. Now, I will say that this one is probably the worst one we've seen so far because its condition is entirely controlled by your opponent, and it is telegraphed. If your hand is really low and they want to keep it really low, they just won't challenge you because they know you'll forfeit to try and draw new cards. So this is probably the worst one because the conditions are entirely determined by your opponent, by what they're doing with the knowledge of what this card is, because it has to be out. There's no way to sneak it out. So this is the worst one. This is actually the one probably worth talking about. The other Dornish card is really good. It's a shadow card called Southern Escort. It's non-unique. So basically you can put it into play for free if you just discard another card from Shadows. Otherwise, you'd have to pay 4 for its Shadow cost, which would be 6 total. Considering it doesn't have any other ability, it's just a body on the board with 2 icons and 4 strength, you are not going to pay 6 total to put this out. But paying 2 and then tossing another card you have from Shadows that also costs you 2, you might pay 4 to put this out, especially because you can spread that over the course of 2 turns. Dornish decks also particularly like Shadow and Ambush because they have a lot of effects that help things that enter play during the challenges phase. So a card like this that can just, for free, pop out in the middle of the challenges phase and all of a sudden have more icons than your opponent thought you did is very good. You do have to be playing a dedicated Shadows deck using other Shadows cards. Now, you can either use the Shadow agenda that lets you run other non-loyal Shadow characters, so you have a bunch of Shadow cards that this will have targets for. You can use the Shadow agenda that lets you put regular cards into Shadow so that you can just sack regular cards that maybe you want in the discard, like Shadow City Bastard if you're running Flea Bottom, which Dorn loves to do. You can also just run a Dornish deck that doesn't use either of those agendas and just has a lot of Shadow cards. This card will be able to come out of play in the middle of the challenges phase. It's a guard card, which has admittedly limited support, and it's non-unique, so you don't have to worry about oversaturating your deck with them. I think this is a decent card. I do get annoyed with these cards that once they're on the field, they don't do anything, but its way of getting onto the field is pretty unique and saves you some cost for a Shadow card, so I don't hate it. It has its place in a Shadow deck for sure. In keeping with the Shadow theme, the first neutral card is our second version of Littlefinger. It's the only other version of Littlefinger that's legal. I like the one from the Things We Do for Love, but this one is legal, and he's a Shadow version. The original version is totally a staple, or it used to be. It's a very splashable card. He's an ally and lord, which are great traits. He's got good icons and strength, constant +1 gold modifier, and when you marshal him, draw 2 cards. This guy does his own thing. He supports the Shadows, so he has an absurd 6 Shadow cost. He is meant for a dedicated Shadow deck. However, unlike Varys, who comes out of Shadows for cheaper depending on how many other cards you have in Shadows, so he goes well in a dedicated Shadow deck and can get himself out easily. Littlefinger does not. He has no way of cheapening himself. In fact, if I were you, I would not even marshal this guy out from Shadows. That's going to be 8 gold because his Shadow cost is the same as his normal cost. I would just use Great Hall because he's a unique character with printed cost 6 to just marshal him for 4, and then once he's on the board, have your other things come out of Shadows. He has stealth, which is helpful. His icons and his stats aren't bad. It is unfortunate that he locks you a bit out of running the other version of Littlefinger. His cost is just kind of too high for such a non-aggressive effect. He has his place. Don't get me wrong, cycling through your deck and your hand, especially up to 3 cards at a time, is a great ability. However, it has to be when something comes out of Shadows. Obviously, you're going to be putting him in a Shadows deck, so it's not going to be super restrictive, but still. Just doing that, your opponent's like, cool. Fiddling with your hand a little bit there. What do you have, events or something? Probably not, because you're probably saving your gold for the challenges phase to bring cards out of Shadows. So I really don't think I have to worry right now. You can do it in the marshaling phase, sure, but you probably want to bring your cards out of Shadows in the middle of the challenges phase. Although it doesn't say forced reaction, so I guess it's your choice. Ultimately, this guy is a Shadow card, and he's Shadow support. I think he'd be best played as though he were Shadow support, but he was not a Shadow card, because shadowing him doesn't really provide any benefits and is very expensive, and I actually think overall that his cost, shadowed or not, even if you're running a dedicated Shadows deck, does not make his ability worth it, even though, do not get me wrong, it is a very good ability. Last neutral card is the White Sword Tower. So this is the Kingsguard location. It's a neutral location. This is kind of terrible. I mean, I run it in my Kingsguard deck just because obviously I have to, but giving every Kingsguard +1 strength, cool, not really a big deal. It's really not that good. Kingsguard is a rare trait, and even if you're running the white books, they're very expensive, so you're probably not going to have that many of them out, although your goal is to get as many as you can. And then can't play more than 1 event each phase. Even if this were 1 event each round, that would only really slow down certain decks. Like, unless you are playing against a deck that just focuses on, during the challenges phase, buffing a bunch of their guys with events, maybe like with the Tyrell events I was talking about earlier. This does not matter. The marshalling phase events, I really doubt are going to be a big problem. And if your opponent has events that are action instead of marshalling or challenges action, they can actually exploit this wording by just playing their challenges action and then doing their action during the marshalling phase, or vice versa. They can still play the events when they want to, because a lot of events have just action. So this secondary effect is terrible, frankly. I think it should say they should not be able to play any events, or at least once per round. At least that would be something that sometimes mattered. But right now, this has no business being 2 cost. It's locked into not only one trait, but one trait that basically requires you to run a specific agenda to even use. It provides them with such negligible support, and then its secondary effect is not only useless, it's completely non-synergistic with what they're about. Not that they have any synergy to begin with other than this weird shadow idea. So I wish this card were better, but you know what? If you're making a Kingsguard deck and you don't run it, then you are just a boring person. 2 plot cards are supporting something that I'd like to try but never have, and that is the city archetype of plot card. So the first one is City of Secrets, so it is a city plot card, and it's got decent stats. I mean, 4 gold is kind of low, but 4 initiative is not bad. There's all those cards like summoning and building orders and stuff that are 4 gold, but then 0 initiative. I'd say if you have middle of the road initiative, that's fine. You'll probably win. So each player draws 2 cards, and then if you don't have a city plot card in your use pile, then you toss 2. Either way, this is helping you and your opponent cycle through your deck. If you want to, it's also helping fill up your opponent's discard pile, or yours if you want to. However, the idea of this would be that you draw 2 cards, and then because you have another city plot card in your use pile, because you're running a city plot card deck, then you don't discard, so you actually go +2, and your opponent just cycles through their deck, but that's still an advantage for them. Unless they had 2 cards in their hand, the fact that they get the choice means they're going to get rid of their worst 2 cards, they're going to burn through their deck, get 2 new cards, but I wouldn't expect it to be too devastating for your opponent, considering that its stats are like middle of the road, decent. So honestly, I haven't fiddled enough with the city strategy to say if this works well or not, but I see what it's going for, and the titular at the gates. We saved the namesake of this pack for last. So this one, like I was talking about before, it has 4 gold, but it has 0 initiative. Although it does have 7 reserve. Although the last one had 8 reserve, which is kind of crazy. So this is a city card, but it's also a kingdom card. And this one is fun, and it's probably the most splashable. You get to pick any limited location in your deck with printing cost 1 or lower. So you're probably going to pick like Great Hall or Gates of the Moon, unless you really want to do one of the ones we've been over today, the in-faction limited ones that are 1. The other in-faction limited ones are 2 cost. Then you get to add it to your hand, or if there are no city cards in your use pile, put it into play. So I think the idea here is that you can splash this into other decks and not worry about the city theme, or because the other city cards like to have a lot of city cards in their use pile, and this does have the city trait, if you're running a city deck, you play this first. But either way, this little like miniature House of the Red Door, the way to start the game off with your choice limited card and not necessarily have to run as many copies of it, and now have more certainty that your gold stream is going to be a little more steady, that's great. This is a good card. This is very splashable, and it works in a city deck as long as you're willing to play it first. It's also a kingdom card, which means the gold value can be reduced by naval superiority, but it also means that you can get an extra gold if you're playing Baratheons and you're playing Stone Drum, and it also means that the illegal card Benjen's Cash will not work if you play this first, but none of you guys care, because most people watching this I don't think are as casual players as I am, and I love Benjen's Cash. It's too bad we only got a little taste of the city archetype. I haven't made a deck with them yet, but there's a ton of plot cards that have the city trait. They're kind of like a miniature version of the winter and summer ones in that they have support, although they don't get directly supported by any main deck cards that I know of. They are a fun little theme. I'd love to make a deck trying them. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this pack opening video. I will see you guys next time for In Daznak's Pit, and I really mean it this time. I really swear.